Hey, everybody. Welcome to lecture 2 of week 1. Um, in this lecture, we're going to talk more about phonetics, which we talked about quite a bit in the last lecture. And we're also going to talk about allophones and phonology, all the pho words we're going to learn about today. Okay, so really today, this lecture is about understanding the different terminology that was introduced in chapter 2. So this lecture really corresponds to chapter 2. So we're going to talk about morphemes, we're going to talk about phonemes, we're going to talk about phonetics, how that's different, and then the broad term of phonology. The critical concepts we're really going to be focusing on in this lecture are the differences between phonemes and allophones. I briefly mentioned allophones in the last lecture, but you're going to understand in more detail after this lecture. So let's just break down some of the terminology that the chapter talked about. So when we think about a word, it's really just how something, a group of sounds are put together, pronounced, and the meaning behind that. When we talk about morphemes, a morpheme could be a word. So, for example, cat is a word, and that is a morpheme. But there's other things that we can add to that word which add meaning. So morphemes are the definition is that they're the smallest linguistic unit that carries meaning. So if we add an S to the word cat, it makes it plural. And we derive different meaning. We know that we're talking about more than one animal, for example. Now, it's important to recognize that sometimes we're adding a letter to the word and it adds meaning. But that letter in the context of another word does not carry any additional meaning. So, for example, the initial S in the word soup doesn't have any additional meaning. It's not adding anything. Soup stands as a word on its own. Okay. So morphology is really just the study of morphemes and word structure. And if any of you have taken any language courses, you've probably done some type of language analysis and you've studied what we often refer to as Brown's morphemes. So these are these little markers, such as plural S, and it could be something like a possessive S, it could be verb endings like ing. So all these different things that we add to existing words to add meaning. Or it could be some other types of grammatical components that can't be broken down any smaller. So often we'll look at things like articles, like a and the, or we'll look at prepositions like in and on. These are all morphemes, okay? And they all are really looking at how someone's grammar is developing, okay? And that's how we often use them in a clinical context. So as we said in the last slide, morphemes are the smallest unit of a language that carry meaning. So we just want to make the distinction here that it's kind of like the distinction we made with the S in soup versus the S in cats, is that sometimes you may see something that is adding some type of meaning, but then those letter combinations are not adding meaning in another word. So it's very important to really be looking closely at the words themselves. So for example, teacher, the word teach is a morpheme. It's a verb, right? And then ER, when it's added to it to make teacher, first of all, turns it into a noun, but ER is a suffix that's added to many words as one who does something. So you could be a teacher, you could be a preacher, you could be a painter. So there's the verb itself, and then when that ER is, it's a person who does that verb. Okay, so in this case, ER has its own meaning. If there's another word like mother, for example, ER in mother is not a separate suffix, right? It's part of the core word mother. It's not, mother is not someone who moths. Okay, so it's important to really pay attention when you're doing a morpheme analysis of the word meanings themselves. Okay, so let's just do one more example. So let's take a word like understand. So we can add the suffix ing to it, and then it would be two morphemes. And we can then add the suffix, the prefix. Prefix come before a word, suffix come after a word. And that is adding yet another morpheme to it. So if we were going to count it out, understanding, we would have three individual morphemes in there that all change the meaning of the word as we add them or take them away. Okay, so there's different types of morphemes. Free morphemes stand on their own. So, for example, a word, we just talked about a couple of different words such as cat. Um, cat is its own morpheme. It stands on its own and we can derive meaning from it. A bound morpheme has to be attached to something else. And this often we're talking about what we refer to as affixes, which are either suffixes or prefixes that are added to a root word. So prefix, pre comes before, and suffix comes after. I mentioned that there's other examples such as plural s or verb conjugations such as ing, possessive s. These are other things that we add, but they do not stand on their own. So er on its own or s on its own is not a word that has meaning. Okay. So we talked about morphemes. Now we're going to talk about phonemes. Okay, so a phoneme is a sound. And this is what we think of and have stored in our brains. So when we hear the word sap, there are three phonemes in that word. So there's the s, a, and p. Those are the three sounds. So phoneme is just another word for sound. Okay. Same for the word sat, s, a, and t. There's three sounds in that word, three phonemes. The word sack, even though it's spelled with a CK, there's not four individual sounds there. There's still only three, s, a, and k. Okay. So as we talked about in one of the previous lectures, we don't want to mix up spelling for sounds because sometimes we have two letters together for one sound. In this example, the CK for the k sound. All right, so if we were going to draw this out in the different ways, so we have the word pugs here. So if we were going to count the morphemes, we say pug is one of those free morphemes, stands on its own, the word pug. And then we have the bound morpheme, in this case, plural s, which cannot stand on its own, but can be added to pugs to indicate the meaning that there's more than one pug. So two morphemes in the word pugs. But if we were going to count the phonemes, and we're going to do this phonetic transcription here, we have how many sounds? Let's count them out. We have the p, g, z. So we have four different sounds. So that phonetic transcription there, that little caret symbol is for the sound. Even though there's only two morphemes, there's four phonemes, okay? So when we're counting these, I have to pay attention to what we're counting here, okay? All right, so how do we store sounds? I'm sorry, how do we store words? Words are stored in our lexicon, okay? So this is kind of a dictionary in your brain, and we make meaning of words as we learn them by connecting them to other words in our brain. I'm going to show you a little visual example of this. So, for example, when we hear the word cat, our brain immediately goes to the lexical neighborhood of animals. Okay, so this is a small mammal. Maybe we think of cats and dogs. Maybe we think of something furry. If we like cats, maybe we think of something nice, like a cat's purring. So we have these lexical neighborhoods or networks in our brain where we make connections when we learn a word and try to tie it to what we already know. Okay, so that really is our lexical uh, part of our brain. And being able to access that is referred to as lexical access. So sometimes if someone has, for example, a stroke or traumatic brain injury, they may have trouble retrieving words. They don't have the ability to access them. So I put in here a link to a fun tool called Word Bank. This is an international tool, and it's based on something called the MacArthur-Bates Developmental Inventory. So um, if you go on to become a speech therapist, you'll probably have some practice with this tool. It's a parent report tool where parents report what words their children can understand and say. And there's thousands and thousands of people who contribute to the data that's in this word bank. And what it does is it tracks words and how children learn them. So I just want to give you, and hopefully this works, a visual example of a semantic neighborhood. So as you could see, this is what it would look like in someone's brain. Um, that, oh, for example, if they hear the word toe, they may think of other body parts such as mouth and eye and nose. They may have another word associated with it, such as if they stub their toe, they say owie. So this is kind of just to give you a visual example of what a lexical neighborhood looks like. Okay, so let me stop sharing just for a second because I think that may have taken us off of our PowerPoint. Okay. All right. So let's talk about phonology now. So phonology is the study of sound patterns in a language. And um, sorry, guys, I'm just going to stop this for 1 second. Okay, let me go back to my slides because I'm not sure you can see that. Okay, now I'm back. Okay. So phonology is the study of sound patterns in a language. And this is very important to us in a clinical application because when we're listening to someone who has a speech sound disorder, we're trying to find out if there's a pattern. Because if there is not a pattern, sometimes that indicates another problem, for example. So one thing we want to be aware of is that um, we have sounds, phonemes, but we also have what's called allophones. So allophones are a variation of how a sound is produced, but you still can recognize the sound, okay? Um, and this is different in different languages. So in tonal languages, so such as Mandarin, um, differences in sounds are made based on tone. In English, it's a little bit different. We're not a tonal language, right? So, for example, I can say an R in my Jersey accent when I say daughter, and you'll still recognize that R. It may sound distorted if you're from California, but it is still an R. Phonology also looks at things such as intonation patterns and stress. Um, this is very important when we talk about syllables, which is in lecture 3. You'll hear some more about that. So we want to study the phonology. We're studying what sounds are possible to be combined in your native language or a language that you're learning. What syllables can be at the beginning of a word and what syllables can be at the end of the word, because this is not universal among languages. Intonation and stress are, well, especially intonation. Intonation is kind of like the melody of language. So in English, if we ask a question, we have that rising intonation. So I could say, if I say, we're going to the movies, I'm saying it as a statement. But if I said, we're going to the movies, I'm asking a question, are we going to the movies? So I didn't change the words that I said, but I did change my intonation pattern. Another faux word. So now we've got phonemes, we've got phonetics, we've got phonology, and another one, phonotactics. So this is really looking at which sounds are permissible in the combination in language and which are not. So let's look at the second example here. So we don't have words that start with ng in English. We have words that end in it, not start in it. But if we were speaking Vietnamese, that consonant cluster combination is permissible at the beginning of a word. So this really differs between languages. Um, I worked with a family that was Russian, and the mom showed me some of the different consonant combinations that could be the beginning of words and the end of words. And again, it's very different from English. So if you're working with families, and if you are in California, you definitely be working with families who speak different languages. It's helpful to learn what some of these phonotactic differences are. Okay, so we've already defined phonemes, and we've talked a little bit about phonetics. So phonetics is really what this class is that we're studying speech sounds. Um, Part of it is gathering the inventory. So I just mentioned if you're learning another language or you're teaching someone who speaks a different language, understanding what their sound inventory is, what are the sounds that are the same between the languages, what sounds are different, is part of studying phonetics. We're going to be focusing in this class on articulatory phonetics, so how sounds are produced, and we're going to go into great detail, especially when we go through the vowel and consonant chapters about the differences in where we produce the sounds, how we produce the sounds. So that is really going to be our focus for this class. Now, um, if you take a speech science class, you probably are going to be studying acoustic phonetics, so the physical properties of sounds. You'll be talking about wavelength and pitch, and that is not something we're going to do in detail in this class at all, but you will do that in speech science. Um, and you'll talk about some of these same things in an audiology class, for example. So auditory phonetics, how sounds are perceived and different from each other. And if we talk about technology, so the example mentioned here, so um, one of my first jobs before I became a speech therapist was working with Bell Labs on the technology that is now Siri and Alexa, and recognizing those subtle differences in how sounds are perceived and how we can then translate that to meaning. So it's very important when you say something to Siri that Siri understands you. So if you've ever been in your car and you've asked Siri to dial someone and Siri did not quite hear the sounds correctly, you may end up calling someone you did not intend on calling. So that's really part of acoustic and auditory phonetics. Okay, so we've talked about the phoneme. So that basic sound segment that distinguishes one sound from another. Okay. And then allophones, again, it's a variant of a phoneme, but you still recognize the sound. So let's talk about this with some examples. So allophones are not necessarily something that we think of as being a different sound. They're still part of the same sound family. So if we hear, I gave you the example of how I say R in daughter versus how you might say daughter. You still recognize the R at the end of those words. So an example we're going to use here, and this would be an example of a narrow transcription. You see those brackets, you see some additional symbols on here. So the word spot, when we say the word spot, the p is softer. I'm going to describe it as softer. Oops, sorry guys. Versus if we said the word pot. So I want you to try it yourself. So you can put your hand in front of your mouth and say pot. And you can feel like a really strong puff of air, but then I want you to say spot. And you can feel a difference. It's not that puff, right? So when we talk about allophones, there's a couple of different ways that we can categorize them. So complementary means that they appear in a predictable way. So we anticipate how we're going to say certain sounds based on where they are in a word. When lots of times when we're saying a word, our articulators, our mouth, our tongue is getting ready for the next sound in the word. We use this a lot in therapy to help kids get their tongue in the right position. So, for example, if I'm saying the word feet, uh, when I start to say that word, feet, I'm already tensing for that high E sound versus if I'm saying the word foe. Um, in that case, doing more of a lax jaw, anticipating that O, right? That low, lax sound of O, foe. So we anticipate and we change how we're producing sounds. So if I say faux, it's low and I'm anticipating it. If I say D, it's high, I'm anticipating it and I'm changing, even though that f is the same at the beginning, it's going to be slightly different based on what vowel is following it. So free variation is a little bit different because these can be just individual variability. So let me give you an example. So um, some, so we're going to go to the second bullet point here. So free variation is you can say something with different emphasis, but it still has the same meaning. So if I say we can wait, and I emphasize that T at the end versus we can wait. I didn't T at the end of the T. You still recognize what I'm saying. It's not making a big difference in the way that it's pronounced. And maybe you might think I'm trying to emphasize it more if I say we can wait versus we can wait. But it's not changing your recognition of those individual sounds. Complementary, as I just gave you some examples, is the sounds are different because we're anticipating those other sounds in the word and we're changing the position of articulators based on that anticipation. Okay? This will become much more solidified as we start really focusing on transcription. All right. So let's just do another example. So we're going to do an example with that p sound again. We did that just a moment ago. So we're going to talk about aspiration. So when we say p, aspiration is what we refer to as a period of voicelessness after the release of the stop and the start of voicing the vowel. So the stop is the p sound in this case. Okay, so I'm going to say that p is aspirated. You can feel it. It's that puff of air. Okay, so the sounds that we aspirate are ones that where you feel that puff. It's there. There's more strength behind them. So p, t, k. They're aspirated at the beginning of the word with that puff of air. It doesn't matter if we say an example before we said pot and spot, it's still the p sound. So we don't distinguish that it's a different sound. So the one where we don't feel that aspiration could be an allophone of p, but it still is p. In some languages, aspiration changes the meaning of the word. So just want to make that point because in English it doesn't, but there are definitely other languages such as Hindi or Thai where different aspirations would completely change the word. You probably would not have noticed this if I didn't point it out in this lecture today. Okay, so just like the other example, pit versus spit. So spit is the complementary allophonic variation. You still recognize that p is p, and when you transcribe it, you would still transcribe it as p. Okay, top versus stop. again, you feel the air on top, not as much in stop. Okay, and k, so cat versus scat, you don't feel that aspiration. The p is an allophonic variation. All right, so we're going to switch gears from allophones now, and we're going to talk about how we really distinguish between different phonemes. So again, different sounds. So minimal pairs is really the way that we make the distinction between different sounds. Okay, they show us if we change just one sound in this word, it changes the meaning. So this is actually something I do a lot when I'm doing tutoring for reading. Student I'm working with, we were reading yesterday, and she read the word jog as jig. And I said to her, sound it out. And she says, what's the same thing, jig, jog? I said, it's actually not the same. He said, jogging is running, doing a jig is doing a dance. So just changing that middle sound changes the whole meaning of the word. So this is just some examples of minimal pairs. So in the words pad and bad, we're only changing the first sound, but it changes, right, the meaning of the word. And likewise in these other words, tab versus dab and cap versus gap. So what this means is that just by changing that first phoneme, we change all the different words. They're all distinct sounds. All right, so why are we studying this? Why is this important? It's important so we can become aware of what these different contrasts are. So as I mentioned, different languages have different rules for understanding, for perceiving the way that sounds are produced. If you, as I gave the example to my student, if you say jig instead of jog, it's not going to make sense. So when she was reading this passage and she used the wrong word there, it didn't make sense in the sentence. When people are learning a new language, really understanding those allophonic distinctions is important, especially if they change the meaning of a word. If someone doesn't understand those different contrasts, that they're going to be misunderstood. So as speech therapists or future speech therapists, it's very important that we understand these differences because someone may have an allophonic variation, doesn't necessarily mean that they're disordered, right? It may just be a difference in how they produce a sound. Okay, so that is it for this study today. So I am going to stop sharing and I'm going to end our recording here and I will see you in class.